Okay, we're going to head in. What we're doing, what Mike and I are doing, is trying to look at what our Anglican roots are and where we've moved from the 1500s to our current age, in a sense, over the last 40, 50 years, and how our thinking developed that we would be open to what's happened. So rather than rehearsing sort of our own private history, I want to look at this much more analytically. And there's a wonderful new book out, reasonably new. I guess, let's see, when was this published? 2007. It's not too, it's new to me. But it's called The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. There's a companion book by James K.A. Smith, who's really quite a good theologian and thinker, which is sort of explaining this book that's really helpful. But I want to start with this sort of, I'm just going to try to condense it pretty quickly and superficially. I mean, as you can tell, this is pretty extensive stuff, but as an initial kind of introduction to how our thinking has changed, or how the pressures, what Taylor would call the pressures that influence, have been sorted out in our own way of understanding the world around us. And let me start with this, that in a way comes out of Cana Council, and a definition of liberal versus conservative. Liberals are certain about nothing. Everything is up for grabs with liberals. Conservatives, or I might say fundamentalists, are certain about everything. Everything has to have. And so then you get expressions like, well, I turned it over to the Lord, so it's all settled. Oh, really? Good luck. And then there are those of us who believe that faith is clear about those things proven by faith. That's an entirely different frame of reference. I was sitting in front of a guy, as we like to distinguish them in Cana, a white guy, and they're trying to get the Nigerian clergy not to do counseling, just to teach the Bible. Well, that's really quite foreign to us, because part of our seminary training was a good bit of counseling, technique and style and training, and I went to the Menninger Foundation to be trained as a family therapist, so it was interesting. I just give these people the Bible and nothing else. Well, how do they understand the context for the Bible that way if you don't understand where they live? So what Charles Taylor talks about is there's two types of pressures on us. So a notion of the transcendent and the obvious temporal in which we live, and that these two pressures are constantly playing in us and calling us one way or the other. What's happened is we've moved to an area, a time of external rewards, in which our context happens to be pleasure and flourishing. But there was a time when the primary reward was eternal, not external, as a source of meaning and validation in our life. Now, you've heard me a lot, I know Kurt has, because we've talked a lot about this when we go skiing, about people who internally validate and those who externally validate. An internally validated person by faith knows they are precious and cherished by God. And then they look at others in the world around them and they see them as a precious child of God, worthy of their own affection, time, care, listening, concern. That's what a Christian is, in my understanding. Then there are those who get their externals, their validation by externals. Driving around the city of New York yesterday, playing bumper car with our rental car to get into the Holland Tunnel to try to get back to the Newark airport. Talk about a land of entitlement. But see, I'm the legendary, venerable Don Armstrong, so I was more entitled than all of them, so I got into the Holland Tunnel. Eric wouldn't drive in New York City. He made me do that part. But what Taylor does is he reverses this in a sense. And he says that our external pressure was a pressure for the sake of survival and community life. And the community pressured us away from evil thoughts and deeds to do what was right for the community. And that's what life was like in the 1500s. To just do the right thing. And there was a common motivation of the community around us to bring us back in line when we went apart from that kind of thinking. When we did, I was thinking about this whole Tinder hookup thing when I was in New York, where that is so prevalent. You all know what Tinder is? It's where you just text out and you get somebody for the evening, just a fellow spirited young person who wants to hook up for the evening. And hooking up doesn't mean going out and having coffee together. It's far more, I wouldn't call it intimate, because that's not intimacy, but it's far more provocative, X-rated than that. And how people live, New York is famous for this, of people living into themselves, and they get that external validation by who they hook up with at night. When it used to be that there was this common motion to bring us all back in line. Now what we have is what my beloved friend Martha Kenton, who I saw at Ed Salmon's funeral, who's in her 90s, she used to talk about people who lived in self-satisfied ignorance. I love the phrase. It's a great phrase. Self-satisfied ignorance. There is no pressure around them because they just ignore it all. And they're perfectly self-contained in their ignorance. They get their news from The View, and there you have it. And so they are just pleased with themselves. Have you ever seen people like that? They're just pleased with themselves. New York is fun like that because people are very pleased with themselves that they live in New York. They think, I'm so much cooler than the rest of the country. Yeah, right. Not in my thinking at all. So what Taylor writes is, he said, individual disbelief is not a private option this is to heretics to pursue on weekends. To the contrary, disbelief has communal repercussions. In other words, when we let people just disbelieve and behave any way they want to, then we have all this fallout from that kind of stuff. And so the truth of the matter still remains what it was 500 years ago, but we have this whole different way to think. So how did we get there? He says that if there is going to be room for people not to believe, if there's going to be room for people not to believe, or believe in what he calls exclusive humanism, that is, life without the transcendent pressure, just with the temporal pressure, there's no sense of accountability beyond ourselves. There's no sense of the ultimate reward being eternal as opposed to just right now. So you grab all the gusto you can right now because nothing else really matters, because there isn't any. You've removed what he calls the obstacles to the transcendent pressure so you can live within your own mind. So this sense of community is removed in our current age, along with all the other obstacles to disbelief, the ability not to believe, not to have that transcendent pressure, and to live in self-satisfied ignorance unto oneself. That's really the thing that's happened. So what's happened is we've emerged into people that he calls have a buffered self. Now this really is going to get to where we are in the church. It really is. It essentially means people who are off the grid transcendently. You know, Colorado is famous for off the grid. You just go up into South Park. Every time we go skiing or fly fishing, we always go by the house of the Planned Parenthood shooter. That, interestingly enough, has some kind of cross on the front of it. And in South Park, there are these they're actually on a grid. If you look at a map, it's all these little roads in the middle of a barren wasteland, but they consider themselves off the grid, living up there. And all over the mountains there are people who are off the grid, which has to do with total disengagement from the pressures that form us. The buffering of the self makes space for this sort of privacy that affords one protection and permission to disbelieve. And this is what Taylor talks about over the course of the last 500 years. We've come to a point where we have convinced ourselves and gotten rid of the obstacles that toward disbelief to arrive at a point of not having any transcendent accountability, to live entirely unto ourselves. Once individuals, he says, become the locus, the center, the focus of all meaning, disbelief no longer has in their mind any social consequences. And that's where we get phrases like, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody. Well, when you do whatever you want, you do hurt people around you. You hurt the whole community in which you live. So what Taylor says is, for the first time in history, a purely self-sufficient humanism came to be a widely available option, a humanism accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beyond personal flourishing. I mean, total individualism, individualistic behavior, self-satisfied ignorance. And what his premise is that for no previous society was this true. And so we've had to come up with a new story about ourselves. He talks about the fact that we are narrative animals, that we define who we are and what we ought to do on the basis of what story we see ourselves in. And see, as Christians, we see ourselves in this larger salvation history story, and our purpose to be disciples to all nations. But this has drastically changed. I missed part of that 4-hour service, and I thought, this is perfect. I wrote the bishop and said, my mother lives in Montclair, New Jersey, and, you know, I don't approve of these ordinations anyhow. So rather than have me stand up and object, can I go see my mom? Yes, go, please, to see your mother. So I went and hung out with my mom, and my sister and her husband came, and my brother-in-law's lived in New Jersey all his life, in New York, and so he knows the good pizza. They make pizza up there. The stuff we get around here is not pizza compared to New York. It's unbelievable. So I thought, well, I'm going to get there just in time to pick up Eric. So I walk into the building, and it is hot. It is so hot. And there literally are people holding, there's a lawyer up in Denver named Felix Poindexter. And Felix flew gun cover on some of my missions in Vietnam. And Felix would put an ice cube on his wrist where the blood came closest to the surface in Vietnam to cool himself off. Now, I don't know if that ice cube was any match for the Vietnam heat, but Felix thought it was, and Felix was so cool, we all thought it was, so we all sat there like this with our ice cube. So a few years ago, all the Vietnam guys wanted to buy the dream motorcycle of the 70s, which was a Triumph 500. Cool motorcycle. Felix writes us all, the carburetors are still junk, don't buy it. Nobody bought one. Because Felix said it. We're all back to that ice cube on our wrist. Whatever Felix says is the deal. And that's part of our story. But I was interested to ask my mother, who's going to be 90 this year, about our story. I'm particularly interested in the gene pool. Now that she's going to be 90, I'm kind of associating ever more closely with her side of the family. We'll see how it works out. But I look much more like my mother's side of the family, so that's good news. Anyhow, our understanding of ourselves and where we stand is partly defined by our sense of having come to where we are, of having overcome some previous condition, and entering into a new, being a new person made out of these concrete particulars that got us where we are today, and that's our story. And interestingly enough, Charles Taylor uses a whole issue of dialectical location, which is exactly what Paul Tillich used, who all the evangelicals hate and I adore, just because he used this whole dialectic thing, a theological dialectic. But he said, so we come out of that. The secular is about a way of constructing meaning and significance, he says, without any reference to the divine or transcendent, thus no story of our conversion. So if you ask any of us, we used to do this thing of spiritual lifelines with the teenagers. At Ed Salmon's funeral, I had a long talk with Nick Clifford, and Nick Clifford was an executive with Mallinckrodt Chemical, and he and I did all the confirmation teaching for 8 years. And Nick and I did this thing where we'd take the kids away for 3 days and work over their spiritual story, so they could see, as young adolescents, 13 and 14, who they were based on their relationship to God, and how that looked into the future, how that set them on a trajectory into the future if they stuck with that narrative of who they are. But what the secular age has done in this buffered self, where we're a world unto ourselves, is it's excluded that aspect of our story and who we are. So, and what we've replaced for a story of victory over the circumstances is we've replaced a story of being victims of the circumstance, which then justifies who we are. But it wasn't enough, Taylor says, for us to stop believing in the gods. We also had to be able to imagine significance and meaning in our lives within this very limited context, to imagine modes of meaning that did not depend on the transcendent entering our lives, converting us, setting us on a trajectory which was going to be our life course, which gave meaning and purpose to our life as we fulfilled God's purposes. The secular, then, is a sum created by additions, which he calls by intellectual multiplication. It's more a matter of the difference between what we it's about what we take for granted. It's a narrative of being a victim of our parents. I mean, Ralph Everett, the psychiatrist we use, has made a fortune listening to how bad people's parents are. You know, and if you're in therapy telling the therapist how bad your parents are, guess what? Your kids are going to do the same about you. And you're going to be the bad guy that formed their lives. And so the narrative is one of being victims of parents instead of the fall of humanity. So the whole blame gets put in this little system. It's a shift in the location of meaning, moving it from the world out there into one's own concept and reframing. I'm always interested in talking to my mother how her stories of my upbringing are so much different than mine. They're really different, and she's delusional. So meaning and significance become then a property of our own minds, something we have perceived and constructed internally. To be human is to be essentially open, you know, to blessing, to curse, to possession or grace. And what Taylor says is we've entered a sense of what he calls disenchantment, and vulnerability to the outside influences are gone. We're totally self-contained and totally make it up ourselves. In modern imaginary minds, our minds are bounded by these inward spaces. So the modern self, in contrast to the pre-modern, what he calls poor self, is so self-buffered and isolated and insulated in its own interior, giving its own autonomous order and meaning to its life. So whatever we do is all right. That's what this basically means. Whatever we have decided and justified ourselves has no outside influence or purpose or transcendent, this is a better way to live kind of thing. So he says the buffering of the self protects us from the danger of not believing in the gods. In other words, there used to be a community kind of understanding that when I was in undergraduate school and teaching the junior high students at St. Paul's Fayetteville Church in New York, I told the kids, you don't straighten up, God's going to get you. And Ed Salmon called me up and said, I've spent all afternoon on the phone with parents. That's not good theology. And I said, oh, yes, it is, and it's the only thing that works with these kids. He says, the buffering protects us from the danger of not believing in the gods, and the privatized individual self protects us from the social stigma of not being part of the team, so to speak. And in this is what he calls a lowering of the bar and how we envision the requirements of a life well lived. So in Christendom, there was a tension between self-transcendent and turning of life towards something beyond normal human flourishing. And this worldly concerns of flourishing and creaturely existence were lessened because of our eternal, the influence or the pressure, for the porousness of our lives about blessing and judgment shifted us in the direction of the eternal instead of what Taylor calls being totally satisfied with the domestic life. So all that has been removed. It was assumed that human life found its ultimate meaning and telos in a transcendental or transcendent eternity, and that the demands of securing such an ultimate life required a certain ascetic relation to the pleasure and demands of domestic life. The spiritual disciplines that we have were sort of considered the nursemaid, the kind of, when we sing hymns, when we come in, like when we sing When Morning, what did we sing this morning? Not When Morning Gilds the Skies. What is the, yeah, it's one of my favorites. I pick all the hymns here, so. Ye Holy Angels Bright. Oh, man, that is one of the best hymns because it lifts you right out of the mundane, right out of our self-satisfied ignorance, right after our world based on human flourishing. Although I must say, Eric and I were emailing this morning, texting early this morning about, oh, thank goodness, we're going into an air-conditioned church. So there are certain levels of human flourishing that we do enjoy. But we're lifted out of that realm into this transcendent telos, into this eternal, an experience of the eternal life. So whereas Christendom allows us to daily engage in the domestic life, it also offers these rhythms and rituals to inhabit the tension between the now and the eternal. And so that's what we do in church. Last Sunday I preached about the difference between, why Eric went on sabbatical to steep himself in the tradition of the church, and that we actually touch base with that heritage in the way we worship every Sunday. And we come here, and it is the organizing principle for our lives, and it does set us on that journey and tell us and makes the eternal transcendent influence bear upon our souls. But what Taylor is really saying is, trying to see what else I have here that is of value other than trying to explain this myself. What's happened is, in the last 50 years, we've entered this realm where we've made disbelief very comfortable. And we've set a whole construct around us in the way we tell our own story, in the context of our own family narrative or personal narrative, where we've moved from my grandmother, Victoria, who my new granddaughter is named after, moved here as a teenager and from Italy. And so that's part of our story, how the family came along, and my father's family from Scotland, and how they did all that. And it's not that they were victims, but how they triumphed. I mean, that's how most of us understand ourselves. But we created this new narrative of victimhood that allows us to just be the people who are victims of the circumstances around us, protects us from any higher expectations, lowers the bars. And so we get into what started in the Episcopal Church. What time is it? I lost 10:41. I lost my watch somewhere over the last couple of weeks, or maybe some guy slipped it off my wrist in New York yesterday. I don't know. That's probably what happened. So that one of the things I found at Bishop Salmon's funeral, when I'd been here 2 years as rector of Grace Church, Ed Salmon got elected Bishop of South Carolina, and of course they loved what we had done there, and I was about the only person on the face of the earth that understood that. So there was this move to get me to come back there from here, which I didn't want to do because we had just gotten started here, and it wouldn't be fair to leave in the context of priestly ministry. But the head of the search committee, who was the chief legal counsel for McDonnell Douglas, and a couple other people told me that the bishop came and met with the vestry and search committee and said, you are not allowed to have anybody who's ever worked for Ed Salmon come back here and be the rector of this church. Can't do it. Why? Because we were firmly entrenched in our story being the biblical story, and that we are people of God, and the external transcendent influence on us is what directed our lives. And this rehearsal of those events and exposing ourselves to the transcendent, dealing with the mundane of life, but on a regular basis, hearing the Word of God, celebrating the sacraments so God was present to us, was very important, ultimately important to us. That's what our lives were dedicated to, and that's what we fostered in the parish. And people came and experienced that and said, yes, this is the way to live life. But you see, even back then, 30 years ago, the bishop wanted a narrative that was very personal, very victimized, very much a self-buffered person who would then have God's blessing to do whatever they wanted. And so we get a church that is no longer evangelical in nature, but is personal, sort of personally stupid nature, just sort of therapeutic. Yeah. What's that word, therapeutic? Yeah, therapeutic moral deism. Yeah. And that's not really what the therapeutic age that I grew up in and you grew up in was really about. It really was really about applying the gospel to the human condition. It was using therapy to understand our sin condition and then apply the gospel to it with hope of regeneration, newness of life. When in fact now it becomes blessing of the poor person, and so we need to accept them and bring them into the fold, and we sit around and kiss each other's boo-boos. You know, that's literally. Right. Yeah, exactly. And so what happened is the church became this sort of organization that no longer represented the transcendent but blessed the fallenness. And it happened over the last 30, 40 years, although it's a 500-year process to get that way. There's a lot of really great stuff in here to analyze that, but in a short period of time, that's basically what he's saying, that we've developed the possibility of disbelief We've removed the obstacles to disbelief. Therefore, we have a culture that is overwhelmingly disbelieving and has no outside influence of a higher authority and a higher expectation and a transcendent eternal goal for life. Therefore, everybody lives unto themselves instead of being held somehow accountable for something else, for something greater than themselves. And so that's how we got to the place we are in the church. So that, and the Nigerians see this. And talking to Julian Dobbs this week about this very confusing visit by the primate, they understand America as having, they wouldn't say it quite this way, they understand it as we hold nothing as certain, and they hold everything as certain. But they see us as a culture of disbelief that needs to have applied to it the possibility of the transcendent. And so one of the things that I've got to do in talking to the primate is not talk about what we can do for them, but how much we need them, because that's what's keeping their missionary effort going here in America and pushing forward. And he's the chairman of CAFCON, which is the majority position in the Anglican Communion. So it's all really kind of tricky, and I don't have a clue what I'm doing. So they're trying to school me in this. But you see how we got where we are in a culture of disbelief, and they come from a culture of great belief, of hard belief. During the service the other day, because I got there late, thinking, I thought, they're 2 hours into this service. It's going to be over. I'm going to go to the reception and say hi to everybody and get Eric and get out of here. And so I go and I hear hear this preacher go, in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. My goodness, 2 hours, they're just getting to the sermon. And they've got the ordination to follow it and communion to follow that. So I walk around the building wondering what I'm going to do in this awful neighborhood in the 97-degree heat with a suit on. And I hear all this yelling from this basement next door. And I go and I peer in this window, and there are these guys just pacing, going, I can't remember what they're saying. It was in Nigerian, but it was something about Jesus. I recognize that. And they were just yelling and screaming. Well, this is a prayer group, an ecstatic prayer group, praying for the people in worship. I wanted to call 911 to help the people who were passed out. There was a woman standing by the door, and she had her hand in a bucket of ice. That's how she was staying cold or cool or not passing out, whatever it was. Yeah, it was just like the ice on the wrist. So what they believe is that our culture of disbelief needs to have the possibility of the transcendent reintroduced to it. And that's why this freedom of religion thing is so important, because religion is losing, on one level, its footing in this system. On the other level, religion always does the best when it's persecuted. I mean, we know that. We know that. We were all sorry when the police and the FBI and the IRS were no longer investigating us, because it wasn't as exciting faith-wise. We thought, what are we going to do? What's going to shore us up now that we're not being investigated? Yeah, Jesse thought that, and so did my kids. So does that all make sense about how we got where we are and where we are? We have a culture that, for the most part, feels no sense of transcendence. They've been forgiven. They've been forgiven disbelief. It's no longer an assumed part of the culture. And on one level, that's good, because then you have an argument to make. If it's assumed, then people don't take it seriously, because it's all just assumed, and neither do the evangelists. So on one level, that's good. But there's a huge study on this, and I think it does affect how we understand ourselves and what we're doing. I think it's an important work he's done. Yeah, Tim. Yeah. And it's one of the things that's of interest in this presidential election is this whole concept that not this time, but the next time we'll have somebody who just has no religious belief running for president. These two candidates feign religious belief. There's no real indication. Now, Jack Luria sent me a good article yesterday about Trump and religious belief that I haven't read yet. Oh, is it? I haven't read this article yet. But I don't see Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton feign Southern Baptist religion, but you see how well that works out for them. Yeah. So we're there right now, but see, the important thing, the issue here is they feel like they still have to declare their religious affiliation because getting the evangelical vote is important. And I think it is important because I don't know how you can hold to the Democratic platform and declare yourself a Christian. I just think they're diametrically opposed. And people say, aren't you afraid you're going to run off the Democrats in your parish? We ran them off a long, long time ago. There are no Hillary people in this congregation. Yeah. So religion still has some say in here, but it's in a context of a culture that has made disbelief totally acceptable. In fact, the majority. So they don't appeal to that transcendent vision and aspiring. That's one of the comments about Donald Trump's speech. There was absolutely no transcendent aspect to it. There was no city on a hill. There was no America as a shining example to other nations. It was totally isolationist, and in as much as they do business with us, they'll get better. That's really what it was. It wasn't. There is no longer culturally in the political field or in the community in which we live, it's okay if you believe, that's fine, go ahead and do that. But we can't base anything in the culture in it because the basic cultural assumption is disbelief and human flourishing. So it's what's best for human flourishing, not where you're headed in the end. Okay. That's about all I know at this point. This is all kind of new material for me, and so I was excited about it and didn't want it. I thought this was more important to where we are and how we got here than just rehearsing particulars.